Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. This is a red currant bush that I'm pruning, and red currants, white currants and gooseberries all have the same pruning regime, and now is the time to do it. And you want to get it open like a goblet, so light and air can get in, you get good ventilation, and really critically, sawfly don't like laying their eggs in an open space. They like a tangle of growth at the base, and then when the caterpillars hatch out, they eat their way up the bush and they can devastate it. So what I'm looking to do is just take out all inward growing branches like that, and you have to be ruthless about it because they do grow very strongly, and then when it's a good shape, just trim it back by about a quarter, and that's all you have to do really. Leave it and wait for the fruit to appear like lovely little shining red beads. Now, with the weather we've been having this month, jobs like this are ones that you can just squeeze in between rain showers, and we've been playing the weather here, trying to keep the garden impetus going. So there's lots to do today, but who knows how much dodging I'll have to do to get it done. This week, Nick Bailey revels in the magnificence of magnolias. And we visit a gardener who started from scratch and created a private haven filled with glorious colour. It's now time to start thinking about summer bulbs. I grow a lot of lilies, and they're very happy in their pots over winter, and they will flower gloriously in the summer. And it's a good time to buy and to plant lilies. But this year I want to grow a few other bulbs that will flower in summer, which are perhaps a little bit less known, but just as easy and just as available. I've got three here. The first is Gloriosa, Gloriosa superba Rothschildiana. It's a climber with fantastic orange, red and yellow flowers, which will reach about 2 or even 3 meters and flower in late summer into autumn. And by potting it up now, I will grow it on, ready to plant out when all risk of frost is gone. I'm actually not directly touching it for the moment, because not only is it poisonous if you eat it, it also can be an irritant for your skin. It'll be fine for my hands because they're calloused and they're hard, but if I touch my face or whatever, that would be a problem. So when I touch it, I will then go and wash my hands, or if you're worried about it, wear gloves from the beginning. Now, at this stage, all I need to do is get a reasonably deep pot, put some ordinary peat-free compost in there. This is a coir and bark-based compost, and bury it so it's covered by about 2 inches of soil. I want to grow that so it's about a foot or so tall, and then I can just lift it and plant it out. An alternative would be just to simply sink the whole pot, if it's big enough, in the ground, because it will need lifting at the end of summer. It's not hardy. So that is one. Now I'm going to wash my hands. Okay, the next one is not poisonous at all. This is Hymenocallis festalis. This is the most extraordinary flower with great long spider-like extensions. It is sometimes known as the spider lily or the Peruvian daffodil, and it has a glorious scent. And you plant it slightly differently. You need a smaller pot and then some compost, and this is planted so the tip is showing. So that is like that, and then just round. It is tender, so it needs looking after, and mustn't put it out until after the last frost, which normally is round about Chelsea time here. Now the last one is an amaryllis, Amaryllis belladonna. And this comes from the Cape, and they all do well in sunshine, but the amaryllis wants as much sunshine as you can possibly give it, and really, really good drainage. So I've got both an extra mix, which has got a lot of drainage in, and I've got some grit to add to it. All right, now do a little bit of grit, like that. And you plant the amaryllis fairly shallowly. Don't plant it too deep, but at the same time, it needs to be covered. And then pack around it. And this will flower right at the end of summer into autumn, September, even October time. So that's 3 very different bulbs, but they're all quite easy to grow and available in garden centres now. So a little bit of forethought at this stage, you can guarantee yourself a spectacular display in late summer. But of course, we want spectacular displays right now, and that's what Nick found when he went down to Caerhayes in Cornwall to see the magnolias in full bloom.
Bold, yet delicate. Brief, but memorable. Feared, yet admired. The magnolia is a plant of contradictions, and if you haven't got one in your garden, now might just be the moment to consider introducing one. Magnolias come into bloom before they've produced any leaves. So imagine a garden in the depths of winter, cold and still. Yet the magnolia's bare branches are covered in beautiful buds, creating a spectacular silhouette and the promise of life to come. Magnolias are one of the most ancient flowering plants. Along with trees such as ginkgos and metasequoias, fossil records have suggested they existed over 25 million years ago, and its ancestors go even further back. They were one of the first flowering plants on Earth, and back then there weren't flying insects, there weren't bees, so they evolved to draw in beetles for pollination. These outer structures had to be tough and leathery so they weren't damaged by the beetle, and all importantly, the carpel, the seed protecting device in the centre, was also woody and tough to make sure it wasn't damaged by the beetles so that the plant could produce future generations of beautiful magnolias. Magnolias are available in a huge range of sizes, colours and forms. Many of the wild species of magnolia, such as this Campbellii alba, tend to be absolutely vast, so they're perfect for big gardens. And look at this, absolutely spectacular. The flowers are literally the size of my head. And you've got this suffused tone which comes into the back of the petal and then layer upon layer going into that beautiful structure in the centre. What a magnificent plant. This is Magnolia sargentia var robusta, and it's one of the biggest of all the wild species. And look at the size of this bud. Not many plants can muster anything of that scale. And of course, that then bursts open and then produces these very, very delicate pink blooms with a boss of carpels and floral structures in the centre. What more could you ask from a flower? Spectacular as it is, we haven't all got space for 15-metre high magnolias, but thankfully there are plenty of small, compact cultivars that will work in most gardens. And this is a good example. This is Magnolia ballerina. It's very different to the typical magnolias you see. Instead of those upright facing tepals, it's actually got many, many more, and they're fine and open. So it's got this beautiful loose quality to the flower. You can also see it's absolutely packed with buds, so it can have a much longer flower run than many of the magnolias. Now, it is small, so works well for an average sized garden, or if you're really limited for space, you can grow it in a container, which will keep it really compact. So most magnolias will only flower for about 2 weeks, and that may lead you to question whether they're really worth growing in the garden. They can't compete with roses or jasmines that keep repeat blooming through the season. but what they do is give you the most delicious teas and prelude to the spring that's just round the corner.
Well, lucky Nick to see the magnolias looking so good. Mind you, they've been really good right across the country. And I shall be planting another one in a minute. Before I do that, I'm just popping in a few fritillaries into this piece of ground. So these are over and above what's already growing. And they're ahead of the ones in the ground because I put these into pots as a kind of insurance, and they've kept them in cold frames over the winter. And you can see this is Fritillaria miliagris, the snake's head fritillary. And as the flower bud emerges, it has this snake-like shape to it, covered with a checkerboard pattern. And it's one of the very few bulbs that likes damp soil. And I'm using a bulb planter to make a hole and pop the whole thing in. And these are for sale now in garden centres. So you can go along, buy some, and A, you have an immediate effect, you can see what it's going to look like, and B, as long as you don't cut the grass or cut back the foliage, that will die back, the bulb will come back next year, it'll spread by seed, and it will last for generations to come. Come on, you. This is the wild garden, and I want to plant a magnolia in here. But before I plant it, it's time to start cutting back. The point about the wild garden, which I started to make a couple of years ago, was to maximise all the potential habitats for wildlife. Hence a pond, lots of cover, some trees, shrubs, and masses of flowers for pollinating insects. Now, over winter, it's important, if you want to encourage wildlife, to leave cover. Leave stems that insects can get in, leave seeds, leave the whole thing untouched. But now we've gone past the spring equinox, winter is gone, and we can clear all this away and start thinking about it as a border that can both look great for us and be full of flowers for as long a period as possible to attract pollinating insects. There are a few snails very snug in under the cover that I'm cutting away. And of course, that's one of the things about encouraging wildlife in your garden. It's not all the fluffy, bunny, cuddly, attractive things that matter. It might feel counterintuitive to give a home to slugs and snails in your garden, but they are an important food source for mammals, birds and frogs. And removing them entirely could upset the delicate ecosystem of your garden. So if they're not doing any harm, leave them alone. This is a magnolia black tulip, and it has fantastic flowers. Rich burgundy plum colour, as dark as any magnolia that you can buy. And I first got it about 4 years ago, intended for the jewel garden, and planted it in the jewel garden. But for 2 years in a row, it flowered and then got hit by frost. And the whole thing looked awful. And I think it would do well in here. Partly because this is a sunny, very sheltered site, and partly because, as Nick pointed out, they're pollinated by beetles. And that will add to the range of insects that we have here. Now, the two things to be aware of when you're planting any tree or shrub for that matter is make your hole wide, but not too deep. And the other thing is, don't add any goodness to the base of the hole. Compost or manure, because all you're doing is encouraging the roots to stay put. What you want them to do is grow out into the soil. And the more they grow out, the bigger and the healthier and the more stable that the tree will be. But what you can do is loosen the base. So just dig it over. By and large, magnolias like acidic soil. They don't like chalk or limestone. But Soulangeana in particular, and also Stellata, are very adaptable, and they will grow in slightly alkaline or slightly acidic soil. I'm going to have to cut this because It's been in here for 2 years and it doesn't want to come out easily, and I don't want to damage the roots. Magnolias have quite fleshy roots, so you have to be careful when you're handling them. They're quite fragile. At this stage, so I'm going to hold it upright and just firm it in. And I haven't staked it, and I'm not going to stake it for 2 reasons. One, because it's got a very heavy root ball, and 2, because this is sheltered, it's quite small, and by not staking it, it's going to become much more flexible and adapt better to wind. And if you can get away without it, the tree will be much stronger as a result. Magnolias don't like to dry out, so I will mulch that thickly to keep the water in, and if we have another really hot, dry summer, just remember to give your magnolias a good drink once a week. Now, last year we were very keen to champion small gardens, and we paid a visit to Tessa Cousin's garden in Chippenham. And it's on the small side, but she certainly has made every square inch count.
I created the garden 5 years ago when I moved to this house. I was able to start the garden from scratch. I wanted a garden where I could sit in the evening sun and read a book and have a glass of wine, but I wanted also to be able to see the sky. I wanted somewhere where I could dream and be away from the world and yet part of it. And so I can now sit in my garden and listen to the birds as well. When I was thinking about the design of the garden, I was working as a life model at the time, and so as I was reclining, I had in my mind the shape of the garden. So in the end, I decided that straight lines would fit the house better. I could have swathes of plants, and I could let the voluptuousness come from the plants. I looked at lots of styles of garden. All gardens are beautiful, whether they're tropical or cottage. I wanted, if it was possible, in a pocket handkerchief-sized garden, to have a more open and airy feel with a more naturalistic planting. So really, I want my very own prairie in my little garden here. The challenge, I think, is death by fence. It can be so hard because they give quite a barren feel, I think. Fortunately, I've got a lovely brick wall as well, so I knew that I would be able to do something about the fence and actually break it up a bit. So I like to think I rescue plants. I like the poorly plant sections. I like looking for unusual plants in stalls as you go past people's houses. And I found that the more unusual plants actually do as well as some of the plants which supposedly are tough old standards. The passion flower I found for £3 in the poorly plants section of a well-known superstore. And I thought, oh, this is not going to stand a chance. But weeks later, it was romping up the trellis, and now it's in full bloom, and it's obviously loving it there. All my plants are special to me. At the moment, I'm particularly loving the Michaelmas daisy, and that's the variety Monk, which is so floriferous and flowers right the way up till Christmas, and looks particularly gorgeous just as the sun's going down. It seems to glow in the evening. I'm also loving my echinaceas. I have 2 varieties, the purple variety and the white swan. They are so droopy and melancholy and beautiful and blousy that I think I could never be without my echinaceas. Another favourite of mine is the Indigofera, which is growing up the trellis and which seems to be developing into a small tree. It has very pretty pink flowers in spring, which appear sporadically throughout the summer. And I love how in the evening the little leaflets fold up, almost as if the plant's going to sleep, and then in the morning they wake up again with me. So that's a wonderful thing. I'm just hoping it's not going to grow too big. I am very fond of my little shed, and you can see that the vine growing over it really loves it too. The blackbirds love the vine, the cats love sitting on the shed roof. It's a pretty little shed and I sit in it sometimes and look out. I love hearing the rain on the roof. My favourite design feature, I think, is the pergola. I had the idea of using concrete reinforcing rods, and I discussed this with my lovely builder, who initially thought I was completely mad, but they went ahead with it anyway, and several weeks later a big flatbed truck turns up with the whole thing on it, so it arrived entirely in one piece. I think there are challenges in any garden. Obviously, with a smaller garden, you can give more care and attention to the plants, but there is a danger of them outgrowing their space. And sometimes you have to be just a little bit ruthless. You have to make sure every plant works for its living. And so if it can have more than one period of interest, that's really good. Although it's a small garden, I have fitted a lot in. It is easy, I think, to try and crowd too much into a small garden, so you have to be selective. My priority has been for a little bit of height, for a shed, and also a compost heap. It doubles as a slug house. I'm happy as long as the slugs remain in the compost heap, but as soon as they venture out at their peril. I love my garden because it is my little haven away from the world. It's a garden I can enjoy all year round. It's my little piece of nature in the middle of the town. It's the constant surprise, really, of never knowing what will work and what won't. So you can just gloriously do your own thing in a small garden.
It is always good to see your gardens. And if you've got a smallish garden that you think is filled with beauty and has given you a huge amount of pleasure, then we'd like to see it. Send us a picture. And also this year, if you have inherited a garden, you've bought a house or you're renting somewhere with a garden that you would like to make your own, but you just don't know where to begin, Adam is on hand. He could come along and give you the benefit of all his experience and skill and set you on the road to creating your own perfect garden. Now, for both those things, go to our website, and we look forward to seeing you. It's a busy time of year, but if there is only one job that you've got time for, then it surely has to be to mulch. I've got here mushroom compost, which is, by the way, not composted mushrooms, but it's cattle manure that's mixed with a lot of lime, and that's what mushrooms are grown in. Mushroom compost is distinctly alkaline, and that's because of the lime that's mixed into it, which makes it great for most spring flowering shrubs. It's great for heavy soil, but not good for plants like rhododendrons or camellias, or, for example, raspberries. And if in doubt, you cannot go wrong with garden compost. Now, there is one critical factor about how to apply mulch, and it must be thick enough. I reckon at least 2 inches, and you just spread it in amongst the plants. Mulching does 3 things really effectively simultaneously. The first thing is to blanket out the light from the soil, which stops weeds growing to a large extent. The second thing it does is to keep in moisture. And finally, if it is made out of an organic material, worms and insects will incorporate it into the topsoil, and that will feed your plants. And if you're doing bark, you can actually pour it on quite easily. bark is slower to break down, so lasts longer. It can be ericaceous, like pine bark, and you would want to use around azaleas, rhododendrons, camellias, magnolias, any of those ericaceous-loving plants. And if you're mulching around shrubs or even trees, it's a good idea to pull it away from the bark, so it's not tight up against it because it can rot it. I would stress that I think mulching is the best way of spending your time and money as an investment on making your garden look good and be healthy all year long. However, it's not the only thing you can be doing this weekend. Here are some more jobs. If you're growing your own seeds, like these chilies, it is important to prick them out as soon as they develop their first true leaves. And as a rule of thumb, these are the second set of leaves to appear. Hold them always by a leaf and not the stem, removing as much root as you can as you lift them. Pot them into a peat-free compost and plant them somewhere warm to grow on so they establish as nice, strong young plants. Shallots are the cook's friend because they make bunches of deliciously sweet bulbs that store really well. The best way to grow them is from sets. Push each set into the ground so that it is half submerged and space them out about 8 or 9 inches apart in rows. Be careful the birds don't pull them out initially, but once they start to grow, they need very little attention other than to be kept weed-free. If you've been storing dahlias over winter, now is the time to take them out. Check them over to make sure that there are no rotten or dried up tubers and there are no slugs or snails lurking in amongst them. Cut the old stems off and then put them into a pot with ordinary peat-free compost to start them into growth. Put them somewhere frost-free, then when they're growing strongly around the middle of May and after the last frost, they can be planted out where you want them to grow. Well, it is now officially spring, even though the weather so far this month has played every card it knows along a winter theme. We've had storms and floods and ice, and I'm sure there's time left for thick snow. But none of that seems to have stopped the flowering of the garden. It's looking good. And the trees and the hedges are beginning to prickle with that energy of new green. Despite the weather, it is all happening and it's going to get better. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. But I'll see you back here at Longmeadow at the same time next week. Till then, bye-bye. Come on.